"Dad, don't sign anything she gives you." The words were small, almost too small for a room that grand, but they landed harder than the string quartet, harder than the clink of crystal, harder than the polite laughter floating beneath the chandeliers. For one strange second, the entire ballroom at Whitmore House seemed to stop breathing. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of it all in a black tuxedo that fit him like armor, one hand around a champagne flute, the other resting on the silver folder his assistant had placed there only moments earlier. He had been seconds from opening it. Now he was staring across a sea of diamonds, silk, and tailored suits at a little black girl standing alone beneath the archway. She couldn't have been older than 9. Her cardigan was too thin for the February cold still clinging to the night, and her sneakers were worn pale at the toes, but she held herself so still, so straight, that she seemed untouched by the weight of every eye in the room. The gold lights above her caught in the tight coils of her hair. In both hands, pressed carefully against her chest, was a large manila envelope bent at one corner like it had been carried for a long time. No one moved first. Then the murmurs started, thin and sharp, like glass cracking somewhere out of sight. "Whose child is that?" someone whispered. "How did she get in here?" another voice asked. Ethan didn't answer because he didn't know. What he did know was that the girl had looked directly at him when she spoke, not at the crowd, not at the guards near the staircase, not even at Vanessa, who was already turning toward the interruption with the calm fury of a woman unaccustomed to losing control in public. Vanessa Whitmore's smile did not disappear all at once. It narrowed. That was somehow worse. She stepped closer to Ethan, the satin of her ivory gown catching the light like polished bone. "Security," she said softly, but the softness in her voice was more dangerous than a shout. Two men near the back wall straightened at once. Still the girl didn't move. She only swallowed once, as if pushing her fear down where no one could see it, and took one small step forward onto the marble floor. Her shoes made almost no sound. Yet Ethan heard them anyway. Heard them the way a man hears something from long ago and cannot explain why it feels familiar. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said, her voice trembling around the edges but never breaking. "My mama told me if I ever got the chance, I had to come find you myself." A few guests exchanged looks. One man gave a low, disbelieving laugh and quickly stopped when Ethan didn't join him. The room had gone too quiet for mockery to feel safe. Ethan set his glass down on a passing tray without taking his eyes off the girl. His face remained composed, but something in his chest had begun to tighten, a private pressure beneath the ribs he couldn't name. He had spent years in boardrooms, courtrooms, hospital corridors, and funeral chapels learning how to keep his expression still. It had become second nature. But now stillness felt less like control and more like delay. "You shouldn't be in here," Vanessa said, stepping in front of him just enough to claim the space between Ethan and the child. Her tone was flawless, smooth enough to pass for concern if you didn't listen too closely. "Sweetheart, whoever brought you here made a serious mistake." Naomi looked up at her, and the look on that little girl's face was not rude, not loud, not dramatic. It was simply unconvinced. "No, ma'am," she said. "The mistake was made a long time ago." That landed differently. Ethan felt it. So did everyone else. Vanessa's jaw held for a beat too long before she turned to the guards again. "Please escort her out." But before the men could take a single step, Naomi lifted the envelope in both hands and said the one thing that changed the room. "My mama died 3 days ago." The words were quiet. They didn't belong under chandeliers or near catered lobster spoons or beside a 6-foot floral arrangement flown in from California that morning. They belonged somewhere smaller. Somewhere with dim hospital lights and tired hands and a child trying not to cry in front of strangers. The ballroom seemed to recoil from them. Even the quartet had gone silent now. Ethan's gaze dropped from Naomi's face to the envelope she held so carefully. Not money, he thought. Not a stunt. Nobody held a trick that gently. "Before she died," Naomi went on, her fingers tightening around the edges, "she told me to find Ethan Whitmore and tell him he's been lied to for years." A visible ripple passed through the guests. Someone turned fully now. Someone else lowered their phone. Vanessa laughed, but there was no warmth in it, no ease. "This is absurd." Naomi's eyes never left Ethan. "Then why are you scared?" The question was so plain, so clean, that it cut through every layer of wealth and manners and rehearsed politeness in the room. Ethan finally moved. Just one step, but enough to shift the entire balance of the night. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. Let her speak. Vanessa turned to him too quickly. Ethan, I said let her speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Naomi looked suddenly even smaller standing there under all that gold light, but her shoulders eased by half an inch, as if those 4 words had given her something to stand on. Then she pulled a single folded page from the envelope, held it up with careful hands, and said, If my mama was lying, then why is your name on the letter that kept you from knowing I was your daughter? The paper in Naomi's hands looked ordinary from across the room. Just one folded page pulled from a bent manila envelope, but the effect it had on Ethan Whitmore was immediate and impossible to hide. His face did not collapse or harden. It did something rarer. It emptied. The color seemed to drain from it by degrees, as if every polished instinct he had built over 20 years in public life had stepped aside at once and left only the man underneath. Vanessa saw it too. That was the first crack. It flashed across her eyes before she covered it with a tight smile and reached for the letter with one manicured hand. Give me that, she said, not loudly, but with the clipped certainty of someone who had never been refused by a child. Naomi pulled the page back against her chest before Vanessa's fingers could touch it. The movement was quick, protective, almost automatic. Not defiant for the sake of defiance. Protective the way children become when the last thing they own is made of paper and memory. No, ma'am, Naomi said. This is for him. The room shifted again. It was not only what she said. It was the way she said it, with fear still in her body but not in command of it. Ethan held out his hand. He did not step forward all at once. He seemed almost cautious now, as though any sudden motion might break whatever fragile thread had drawn this moment into existence. Bring it to me, he said. Naomi looked at him for a long second, measuring something children often measure better than adults do. Not his money, not his reputation, whether he meant it. Then she crossed the marble floor, one soft step at a time, past guests who moved aside without being asked, past a tower of white roses and candlelight, past a waiter holding a silver tray frozen mid-turn. By the time she reached him, the room no longer felt like a gala. It felt like a church after bad news. Ethan took the page carefully, making sure his fingers did not brush hers too suddenly. The letter was old. He could tell that before he even opened it. The paper had softened at the folds. The ink had bled slightly near one edge, as if damp air or tears or years in a cardboard box had gotten to it before tonight. At the top of the page was his name. Not Mr. Whitmore. Not Ethan Whitmore. Just Ethan. His throat tightened. He knew that handwriting before he fully admitted that he knew it. Slender loops. Firm downstrokes. A slight right slant that always made the last letter in a word look like it was reaching for something. Lena. The name passed through him without sound. Ethan did not sit, but his body seemed to forget for a moment that it was standing. He read the first line. Then he stopped. Then he read it again, slower. Vanessa took half a step closer. This is not the place for this, she said, her voice low now, urgent enough that only those nearest could hear. Someone is manipulating that girl. We need to handle this privately. Ethan did not look at her. That, more than anything, unsettled the people watching. He was always composed with Vanessa, always measured, always aware of the room. Now his attention had narrowed to the page in his hands, and the child waiting in front of him with both fists clenched at her sides like she was trying to hold herself together through sheer effort. Where did you get this? He asked. Naomi answered right away. My mama kept it in a cookie tin in the top closet. She said I was not supposed to open it until she knew for sure she was not getting better. A woman near the piano covered her mouth. Someone else turned away, suddenly embarrassed to be witnessing something so private in a room built for spectacle. Ethan looked down at Naomi. Your mother's name. Naomi swallowed. Lena Carter. It was not a dramatic moment on the outside. No one gasped this time. No one whispered. The silence had gone too deep for that. But inside Ethan, the name struck like cold water. Lena Carter. Not a rumor. Not a setup. Not a clever guess pulled from tabloids or old interviews. The real name. The exact name he had not heard spoken aloud in over 9 years. He remembered a summer porch in Charleston. He remembered iced tea sweating rings into a wooden table. He remembered Lena laughing because he had tried to fix a broken screen door and made it worse. He remembered the last phone call, the one he never understood, the one after which every message had stopped and every lead had gone dead. Vanessa's voice cut in again, thinner now despite her effort to sound composed. Ethan, please. Think about this. He finally turned his head. His eyes did not rise. They sharpened. I am. 2 words. Flat. Controlled. But Vanessa took a small step back anyway. Naomi noticed. Children notice everything when adults think they are too young to understand. Margaret Bell, the house manager who had served the Whitmore family for nearly 18 years, had been standing near the western doors the whole time with a silver tray in her hands. Now she set the tray onto a side table because her fingers were beginning to tremble. Her gaze moved from Naomi to the letter to Vanessa, and something like recognition, old and uncomfortable, passed over her lined face. Daniel Cross, Ethan's attorney, adjusted his glasses and came closer with the wary precision of a man entering territory where legal judgment and human grief had become dangerously tangled. Ethan, he said quietly, if this involves personal correspondence, perhaps we should move to the study. Naomi's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Ethan, as if terrified. That moving rooms meant losing her chance to be believed. Ethan folded the letter once, carefully, exactly along its old crease. Yes, he said, still looking at Naomi. But she comes with us. Vanessa opened her mouth. Ethan did not let her speak. And so do you. The words were calm, but there was something under them now, something harder than anger and colder than shock. It sounded like a door unlocking after years of being held shut. Naomi drew a shallow breath. For the first time since she had entered the ballroom, her shoulders sagged by the smallest amount, not in relief exactly, but in exhaustion meeting hope and not quite trusting it yet. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed the faint scuff marks on her sneakers, the cardigan buttoned wrong at the middle, the way she kept glancing at the envelope in her own hands to make sure she had not dropped anything else. Is there more? He asked. Naomi nodded. There is a picture, and 1 hospital bracelet, and 1 paper with your name on it that my mama cried over every time she read it. Ethan closed his hand around the folded letter. Then let us see all of it. The study felt smaller than it should have for a room lined with 12-foot shelves, dark walnut paneling, and windows that looked out over 3 acres of winter lawn silvered by moonlight. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way truth, once invited in, took up more space than furniture ever could. Ethan Whitmore stood behind his desk, but did not sit. The folded letter remained in his hand, the edge of it pressed so firmly beneath his thumb that the paper had begun to bend. Naomi stood near the leather chair Daniel had pulled out for her, though she had not climbed into it yet. She seemed too careful to touch anything that looked expensive. Her envelope was still tucked against her chest, her elbows pinned close to her body, as if she had learned early that the safest way to exist in other people's houses was to take up as little room as possible. Vanessa closed the study door behind them with more force than grace, and turned with a brittle calm that no longer looked natural under the lamplight. Margaret remained just inside the doorway, hands folded, eyes lowered, though Ethan noticed she was listening harder than anyone. Daniel set a legal pad on the side table and took out his glasses again, but even he looked less like an attorney now and more like a man trying to predict where a family secret might detonate. Sit down, Naomi, Ethan said. His tone was gentler than before, but it still carried the habit of command. Naomi looked at the chair, then at him, then climbed into it slowly, her feet not even reaching the floor. That detail did something to him. A child. A real child. Not a headline. Not a scheme. 9 years old, sitting in a chair built for powerful adults, with a dead woman's envelope in her lap, and no one in the world left to stand beside her. Vanessa crossed her arms. This has gone far enough, she said. A child shows up with an old letter, and suddenly we are acting as though every lie ever told about wealthy men might be true. Ethan turned his head and looked at her with an expression so still it made the room colder. No, he said. We are acting as though I recognize the handwriting of someone I once loved. Vanessa's breath caught. Only once, but it was enough. Naomi saw that too. Ethan walked around the desk and sat opposite Naomi instead of above her. The move was subtle, but it changed the room. He was no longer the billionaire receiving a disturbance. He was a man trying, perhaps for the first time in years, to hear something he should have heard long ago. You said there was more, he told her. Naomi nodded and opened the envelope with both hands, careful not to tear the softened seam. She removed the contents one by one, placing them on the polished table between them with the solemn precision of a child setting out treasures too important to drop. First came a photograph, old and glossy at the center, its edges whitened with age. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs before he even picked it up. It was him, younger by more than a decade, no gray at his temples yet, laughing at something beyond the frame. Lena stood beside him in a denim jacket, her hair caught by the wind, one hand pressed to his shoulder. They were standing on the harbor in Charleston. He knew the day because he remembered the heat, remembered the smell of salt and diesel in the air, remembered buying her a paper cup of peach ice cream. She said tasted nothing like peaches and finishing it anyway, because she hated wasting food. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in Lena's handwriting, were 7 words. "You still look serious when you are happy." Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. He had not said that sentence aloud in years, but she had teased him with it constantly that summer. Vanessa shifted beside the window. "Photographs can be forged." Naomi did not answer her. She placed the second item on the table. A faded hospital bracelet. White plastic, the print nearly rubbed away except for one clear line. Lena Carter. Beside it, a date. Ethan stared at it too long before he understood why his pulse had started hammering. The date was 9 years ago. Mid-October. He looked up slowly. That was 2 weeks after she disappeared. Naomi's fingers twisted together in her lap. "She did not disappear," she said quietly. "She had me early. She got sick after. My mama Louise said she almost died that night and nobody from your office ever came because the address on the file had been changed." Daniel's head lifted. "Changed by whom?" Naomi swallowed. "I do not know, but my mama kept one more paper." She slid the final document forward. It was not sentimental like the others. No soft folds. No signs of tears. It was crisp, official, copied on legal stock, and stamped with a date Ethan recognized from the worst season of his life. At the top were the words change of contact authorization. Beneath them, his name. Beneath that, Lena's. And at the bottom, a signature authorizing all future communication to be redirected through an administrative intermediary until further notice. Vanessa moved then, not toward the paper but toward the drinks cabinet, as if suddenly thirsty. Ethan never took his eyes off the form. "That is impossible," he said, though he no longer sounded certain. Daniel stepped closer and bent over the page. "This is from Whitmore Holdings letterhead," he said. "It is real enough to have passed through internal records." Ethan's voice dropped. "I never signed this." Naomi looked at him with an expression too old for her face. "I know," she said. "That is why my mama kept crying when she read it. She said somebody wanted you to think she walked away, and somebody wanted her to think you did not care enough to look." The study fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of wealth or manners. It was the silence that comes when the shape of betrayal is suddenly visible on paper. Ethan lifted the form with slow, careful hands. Then he saw it. Not the signature at the bottom. The initials in the margin beside the reroute request, written in blue ink, so small most people would have missed them. VW. For a moment, nobody in the study breathed. The blue initials in the margin were small, neat, almost elegant, the kind of mark a person leaves when they believe no one will ever look closely enough to matter. But Ethan looked. He looked so long that the room itself seemed to sharpen around him, every edge harder now, every sound too clear. The grandfather clock by the far wall ticked once. Then again. Naomi sat very still in the leather chair, her hands folded tight in her lap, watching his face the way children watch the sky before rain, not because they can stop what is coming, but because they know it is coming anyway. Vanessa set her glass down on the drinks cabinet without taking a sip. "That proves nothing," she said, and this time her voice was too quick, too polished, as if she had chosen the sentence before she had fully felt the moment. Daniel reached for the form. "Let me see it." Ethan handed it over, but his fingers did not want to let go. Daniel adjusted his glasses and examined the page under the desk lamp. The light caught the legal stamp at the bottom, the official routing code, the internal reference number along the top. Real. Corporate. Boring, even. The kind of document powerful people stopped seeing after the first few years because paperwork was simply the wallpaper of their lives. But that was the danger of boring things. They slipped past the heart wearing the face of routine. This was processed through the executive correspondence office, Daniel said after a long beat. There is an approval chain here. Somebody moved this through more than one set of hands. Ethan's eyes stayed on Vanessa. How many years were you handling my private scheduling by then? Vanessa straightened slowly, lifting her chin in a way that usually made people retreat. It did not work tonight. I handled many things, she said. Because you were grieving. Because your life was falling apart. Because if someone had not stepped in, you would have drowned in your own company. Naomi flinched at the sharpness in her voice, and Margaret noticed at once. She crossed the room quietly and rested a hand on the back of Naomi's chair, not touching the child, just letting her know she was not alone in the room anymore. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed everything now. The way Vanessa refused to look at the photograph. The way Margaret's mouth had gone thin with some old memory she clearly wished would stay buried. The way Naomi kept glancing at the bracelet, as if the little strip of hospital plastic were somehow warmer than the adults around her. Did you know Lena was pregnant? Ethan asked. Vanessa gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You cannot possibly be serious. Answer me. The words were quiet, but they landed like stone. Vanessa's face changed then, not into guilt exactly, but into irritation that she had been forced onto ground she no longer controlled. I knew she was unstable, she said. I knew she had a talent for emotional chaos. I knew she was bad for you. Naomi's brows drew together. Children always heard the moral shape of a sentence faster than adults did. Ethan did not blink. That is not what I asked. Daniel lowered the form and looked toward Vanessa with a caution that was beginning to resemble suspicion. Mrs. Whitmore, the initials in the margin may or may not be yours. We can verify that. What matters right now is whether you had prior knowledge of redirected correspondence involving Miss Carter. Naomi looked up when he said her mother's name that way, with respect instead of dismissal. Vanessa turned to the window, where the lawn beyond the glass shimmered silver beneath the outdoor floodlights. Do you know what it was like back then? She asked, but she did not sound like she was asking anyone to answer. He was impossible to reach. Men like Ethan are not really men when they are grieving. They are absences in expensive suits. He forgot meetings. He stopped eating. He signed things without reading them. He stood in his office and stared at the same skyline for an hour at a time, as though the whole city had failed him personally. Ethan's face did not soften. If anything, it went stiller. So you decided for me. Vanessa turned back. Someone had to. The words hung there, stripped of polish now, too honest in the worst way. Naomi looked from one adult to another, her small fingers slowly tightening around each other until the knuckles went pale. My mama said that is what rich people do when poor people have something inconvenient, she whispered. No one answered her at first, perhaps because no one could. Ethan stood and walked to the bookshelf, not to escape the conversation, but to move through it. His fingers dragged lightly along the spines without seeing them. History, finance, law, biographies of men who had built railroads and ruined nations. He had spent his entire adult life mastering structures, contracts, negotiations, power. Yet one redirected file, one hidden letter, one frightened woman in a hospital bed had been enough to steal 9 years from him without his knowing. He turned back toward Naomi. Tell me about your mother, he said. The shift in his voice changed the room more than any accusation had. Naomi blinked, surprised by the question. Then she looked down at the bracelet and answered in the simple, careful rhythm of a child trying to say something true without saying too much at once. She worked nights at a bakery before she got too weak. She burned pancakes every Sunday because she talked while cooking. She kept your picture in a Bible, even though she said she was too mad at you to pray for you anymore. She still prayed anyway. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. When he opened them again, the control was back, but now it had grief inside it. Naomi continued, softer now. She never said bad things about you when I was little. Only later. When I got old enough to ask why nobody came to school things, or the Christmas concert, or the science fair. Then she would get quiet and say you made a choice. But after she got sick, she said maybe the choice was made for you. Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the chair back. Daniel set the document down with great care, as if the paper had become heavier in the last few minutes. Ethan looked at Vanessa, and when he finally spoke, there was no anger in his tone. That was what made it frightening. You will tell me everything. Tonight. Vanessa gave a thin smile that did not reach her eyes. And if I do not? Ethan glanced at Daniel, then at the file, then at Naomi, who sat there in a mismatched cardigan and worn sneakers, carrying the wreckage of other people's decisions in a paper envelope against her knees. Then for the first time in a very long time, he said, I will start asking the questions I should have asked 9 years ago. Vanessa did not answer right away. She moved back toward the drinks cabinet, not because she wanted the drink now, but because distance was the last kind of control she still understood. The crystal decanter caught the lamplight and broke it into thin amber lines across the wood, and for a strange second the study looked too beautiful for the truth inside it. Naomi sat with both feet dangling above the rug, small enough that the carved leather chair seemed built to swallow her, yet somehow she remained the steadiest person in the room. Ethan saw that and hated himself for noticing it so late. A child should not have had to walk into a mansion alone carrying proof that grown adults had failed her before she ever learned long division. Everything, Ethan repeated, his voice level. Start with the rerouted correspondence. Vanessa let out a breath through her nose, almost a laugh, but there was no ease in it. You are going to put the word of a dead woman and a frightened child above the years I stood beside you. Ethan's face did not change. Tonight is not about loyalty. It is about facts. Daniel remained near the desk, one hand resting on the legal form, the other on his glasses, as if the body sometimes needed something small and physical to do when a room was filling with moral collapse. Margaret still stood behind Naomi's chair, silent as ever, but her eyes had lifted now. They had the look of someone who had spent too many years serving tea in rooms where truths were discussed only after the doors were closed. Vanessa turned her gaze on Naomi then, and the child seemed to feel the full force of it. Naomi straightened without meaning to, shoulders drawing tight, chin lifting by instinct. Ethan noticed that too, and his voice came out harder than before. You do not look at her. You answer me. Vanessa blinked once, caught off guard not by the command itself, but by the fact that he had given it for Naomi. Fine, she said. You want facts? Here's one. Lena came back into your orbit at the worst possible time. Your board was already nervous. Investors were watching everything. You were grieving your father, restructuring the foundation, sleeping 4 hours a night, and making reckless decisions because you thought pain was the same thing as clarity. Ethan stared at her. And that gave you the right to intercept private correspondence? It gave me the obligation to protect what you were too distracted to protect yourself. Naomi frowned. That is not protecting. That is stealing. The sentence was simple, and because it was simple, it hit harder than anything Daniel might have said in polished legal language. Vanessa looked at Naomi with open irritation now. You do not understand adult decisions. Naomi's hands tightened around the edge of the chair. I understand missing somebody I never even met because somebody else thought they knew better. The room went quiet again. Margaret lowered her eyes for a moment, and Daniel cleared his throat, though he had nothing useful to add. Ethan moved back toward the desk and picked up the photograph of Lena from the table. His thumb brushed the white-worn edge where years had touched it. Did you know she was carrying my child when those letters were redirected? He asked. Vanessa folded her arms. I suspected. The words seemed to land in the room with a physical weight. Ethan's jaw shifted once. Just once. Naomi looked down at her own lap, and for the first time since entering the study, her composure flickered. Not because of drama. Because hearing your whole life reduced to the word suspected could do that to a child. Ethan saw the change in her face and turned back to Vanessa with something colder in his expression. And you never told me. I told myself it might not even be yours, Vanessa said quickly. Lena had vanished. She refused direct contact. She was emotional. Inconsistent. I made a judgment call. Daniel finally spoke. A judgment call that appears to have included altering executive routing documents. Vanessa did not even look at him. You were not there. No, Daniel said quietly. But the paper was. Ethan placed the photograph down with excruciating care. When he spoke again, his voice dropped so low that everyone leaned in to hear it. Did she write to me? Vanessa hesitated. That was enough. Ethan took one step toward her. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just undeniable. How many times? He asked. Vanessa's mouth parted, then closed. The silence stretched. Somewhere beyond the study walls, far away now, the muffled sound of a car door outside drifted through the winter glass. The gala was dissolving downstairs. Guests would be whispering in hallways, pretending not to speculate while doing exactly that. None of it mattered. Finally, Vanessa said, 4. Maybe 5. Naomi shut her eyes for a second. Ethan did not. And you answered them? Not directly. That is not what I asked. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. Yes. Margaret made the slightest sound then. Almost nothing, but enough that Ethan looked at her. She lowered her gaze as if regretting it. Margaret, he said, if you know something, say it. For years the older woman had perfected the art of being useful without being visible. Tonight that art failed her. She clasped her hands tighter. There was a box, she said carefully, in the old apartment office. Back when you still kept personal mail separate from company mail. Mrs. Whitmore asked me twice to bring up envelopes marked private because she said you were not to be disturbed with emotional matters during market hours. Vanessa's head turned sharply. That is a creative memory. Margaret did not look at her. I remember because one envelope had a small pressed daisy taped inside the flap. It fell out when I carried the stack. I asked if I should return it. You said to throw it away. Ethan went completely still. Naomi opened her eyes again and stared at Margaret, then at Ethan, as if she too understood that sometimes the smallest image carried the deepest wound. A daisy. Lena used to leave them in books, in cups, inside jacket pockets, because she said beautiful things should arrive where people least expected them. Ethan remembered that. He remembered everything now, and memory was beginning to feel like punishment. Vanessa laughed, but it sounded brittle enough to shatter. We are really going to build a criminal case out of flower petals and old grief. Ethan looked at her, and for the first time all night, there was no confusion left in his face at all. Only recognition. Not of the woman he married. Of the woman he had refused to see clearly, because seeing clearly would have required admitting how much had already been lost. Naomi slid off the chair then, her sneakers touching the rug at last. She walked to the table, opened the envelope one more time, and pulled out a final folded note, so small it could have been missed among the larger papers. My mama said this one was the worst, she whispered. Ethan took it from her. The handwriting on the front was not Lena's. It was neat, formal, typed by hand in blue ink. Delivery failed. No response requested. Inside, in a second line added beneath the first, were 5 words that made the room turn colder than the night outside. Do not contact Mr. Whitmore again. The note in Ethan's hand weighed almost nothing, yet it seemed to pull every bit of air out of the study. Do not contact Mr. Whitmore again. 5 words, typed in blue ink. No signature at the bottom, no explanation, no softness, no room for misunderstanding. Just a door closed by someone who had no right to close it. Ethan read the sentence once, then again, and the second time was worse because now he could hear what it must have sounded like in Lena's mind. Not corporate, not procedural, personal, final. He lowered the note slowly, but his hand did not fall all the way to his side. It stayed suspended there, as if some part of him still could not believe paper had managed to outlive love. Naomi stood beside the desk, her small cardigan sleeves pushed halfway over her hands, watching him without speaking. She had brought him everything her mother left behind, and now there was nothing left to protect him from. Vanessa was the first one to move. She let out a breath that might have been frustration or fatigue, then reached for the back of a chair as though the room had grown unsteady beneath her. That note proves nothing about intent, she said. It could have been drafted by anyone in the correspondence office. You are reacting emotionally to fragments. Daniel looked up from the legal form, then at the note, then at Vanessa. Fragments can still establish a pattern, he said, especially when every fragment points in the same direction. Ethan did not take his eyes off the paper. Did you write this? Vanessa gave a slight shake of her head, too quick. No. Did you order it written? Silence. Ethan raised his eyes at last. The look in them was no longer shock. Shock had burned through already. This was something steadier, more dangerous. This was a man beginning to sort grief into evidence. I asked you a direct question. Vanessa straightened. I may have approved language to discourage contact until things stabilized. Naomi blinked. Things, she asked softly. Or him. Vanessa turned toward the child, and for a second the mask slipped entirely. Not rage. Not cruelty for its own sake. Something colder. Annoyance that a little girl in scuffed shoes had disrupted a story she had been living inside for years. Adults had responsibilities you cannot understand, Vanessa said. Naomi's face did not harden. It did something sadder. It closed. My mama understood bills, she said. She understood working when she was sick. She understood telling me stories at night, so I would not be scared when the lights got shut off. She understood waiting on somebody who never came because she thought he did not care. I think she understood enough. Margaret closed her eyes for one brief moment. Daniel looked away toward the window, as if professionalism had become impossible to maintain in a room where a child was explaining abandonment better than the adults who caused it. Ethan set the note down on the desk with exacting care, lining it beside the hospital bracelet and the photograph as though order might still matter. Tell me what happened after the first letter arrived, he said. Vanessa said nothing. He repeated, step by step. She laughed once under her breath, but there was no confidence left in it. You were unraveling, she said. You had not slept properly in weeks. You canceled 2 investor dinners and nearly walked out of a board vote because someone mentioned Charleston in passing. Lena knew exactly when to reappear. Ethan's jaw tightened. She did not reappear. She tried to reach me. With what? Vanessa snapped. A baby? A demand? Another emotional disaster dropped in your lap while your company was hanging. By a thread. Naomi flinched, and Ethan's head turned toward Vanessa so fast that even she stopped speaking. The silence after that felt sharp enough to cut. You will not talk about my daughter as if she was a problem to be managed, he said. Daughter. The word landed in the room before anyone could prepare for it. Naomi's lips parted. Daniel looked down. Margaret's hand flew lightly to her chest. Vanessa stared at Ethan, and for the first time all evening, she seemed to understand that something irreversible had just happened. Ethan heard the word too, heard it leave his mouth before his mind had fully caught up. Yet once it was spoken, it did not feel mistaken. It felt late. Naomi looked at him as though she was trying not to believe something too quickly. Children who have lost too much often treat hope like a hot stove. You do not know that for sure, Vanessa said, but her voice had thinned. No, Ethan answered, but I know enough to know what you took from her. And from Lena. And from me. He moved to the desk phone and pressed a button. The old landline clicked to life with a muted tone. Caroline, he said to the night operator downstairs. I want guest departure handled quietly. No press access to the grounds. No exceptions. And send someone to wake the records archivist. Tonight. Vanessa stared at him. You cannot be serious. I have rarely been more serious in my life. He hung up and turned to Daniel. I want every internal routing log from the correspondence office from 9 years ago through the following 18 months. Any private redirections. Any off-book approvals. Any document bearing those initials. If someone buried letters, they left fingerprints somewhere. Daniel nodded once, already reaching for his phone. The legal mind was back in his eyes now, but so was something else. Shame, maybe. For how many years he had stood close to power and never thought to question the quiet machinery around it. Naomi looked suddenly unsteady, and Margaret knelt beside her chair at once. Sweetheart, she murmured gently, have you eaten anything tonight? Naomi gave a tiny shake of her head. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Of course she had not. She had walked into a mansion full of polished silver and candlelit food displays, carrying her dead mother's envelope, and no one had thought to ask if she was hungry. Margaret, he said, his voice roughening in a place he could not hide anymore. Please bring her something warm. Soup, tea, whatever she likes. Naomi looked up. I do not want to miss anything. Ethan met her eyes. You will not. Not anymore. The promise entered the room quietly, but once spoken it seemed to settle over everything else like a second kind of light. Naomi nodded once, not because she fully trusted it yet, but because some small part of her wanted to. Margaret rose and guided her gently toward the side door that led to the private pantry. Naomi took 2 steps, then stopped and turned back. There is one more thing, she said. Ethan felt his heartbeat shift. What? Naomi looked at the note on the desk, then at Vanessa, then back at Ethan. My mama said the person who sent that note also came to see her once. In person. At the hospital. The words seemed to remain in the air even after Naomi stopped speaking. At the hospital. Ethan did not move right away, but something in his face changed with such force that even Daniel, who had spent years watching men lose fortunes without blinking, looked away for a moment. It was one thing to discover letters had been intercepted, calls had been blocked, records had been bent into silence. It was another thing entirely to realize someone had crossed the final private threshold and stood in a hospital room where Lena had been weak, frightened, and newly holding a child he never knew existed. Naomi stayed near the side door, one hand resting against the frame, as if she was not sure whether she should keep leaving or stay and finish breaking open everything at once. Margaret stood close beside her with the kind of steady quiet that did not ask children to be brave, only let them be tired. Vanessa was the first to speak, though even she sounded less certain now. "You are relying on the memory of a sick woman from nearly a decade ago." Naomi looked at her and did not raise her voice. "My mama forgot birthdays sometimes. She forgot where she put her keys. But she never forgot that lady." Ethan's eyes lifted to Naomi. "What did she say?" Naomi swallowed, then stepped back into the room with slow, careful feet. The study lamps cast warm light across her face, but they could not soften what she had to say. "Mama said the lady came when I was 2 days old. She wore a cream coat and smelled like flowers that made her head hurt. She asked the nurse for 5 minutes alone. Mama said she knew right away she was not there to help." Vanessa let out a dry laugh that sounded like it had been borrowed from another woman's mouth. "This is absurd." But no one looked at her. Naomi kept her eyes on Ethan because he was the one she had come for, the one her mother had named even through anger, even through disappointment, even through illness. "Mama said the lady looked at me first." "Not her. Me." "Then she asked if I had your eyes." Ethan felt something deep inside him tighten until breathing itself became work. He knew that phrase. Lena used to joke about eyes as if they were proof people carried the weather of those they loved. He remembered her once touching his face in a parking lot outside a diner in Charleston and telling him his eyes looked serious even when his heart was not. The memory arrived, so clean it hurt. "What else?" he asked. Naomi pulled the sleeves over her hands again, a nervous habit he was already beginning to recognize. "Mama said the lady told her something like this. She said, 'Ethan Whitmore has a life that cannot survive this kind of complication.' She said if Mama cared about you, she would disappear quietly and stop making herself a burden." The last word fell hard in the room. "Burden." Daniel's mouth tightened. Margaret lowered her eyes, and Ethan turned toward Vanessa with such stillness that the silence around him became louder than shouting ever could have. Vanessa crossed her arms again, but now the gesture looked less like elegance and more like self-defense. "You expect me to answer to a paraphrased accusation from a woman who is not here to be questioned?" Ethan took one step toward her. "No," he said. "I expect you to answer to the pattern." She stared at him, chin tilted, still trying to occupy the role she had always occupied in this house. The woman with poise, with order, with the last word. But the room had shifted too far. Naomi was not just a child with a story anymore. She was a living seam connecting every torn piece. Ethan looked toward Naomi again, and when he spoke, his voice changed. It lost its polished public edge and became something lower, rougher, almost private. "Did your mother say whether the woman gave her a name?" Naomi nodded once. "Not first. Mama said she already knew who she was because she had seen her in magazines with you. But when the nurse came back, the lady signed the visitor paper downstairs." Ethan's gaze sharpened. Daniel caught it at once. "Hospital visitor logs," he said quietly. "If the facility kept archived records, there could be a signature, a date, maybe even security footage if it was later digitized." Vanessa turned to him sharply. "You cannot seriously be entertaining this." Daniel met her eyes for the first time that night, without flinching. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am past entertaining. I am observing." Ethan moved to the desk and picked up his phone again. He pressed another line, one that connected not to the household but to his personal office. When the late-night administrator answered with a sleep-thick voice, Ethan's tone cut clean through it. "I need the records team to pull every archived interaction involving St. Catherine Medical Center from October through December 9 years ago. Foundation donations, legal outreach, vehicle logs, security logs, anything. Now." He hung up before the startled voice on the other end could answer. Naomi watched him with a strange expression, part hope, part caution, as if she had been preparing herself all night for disbelief and did not know what to do with belief arriving this fast. Margaret touched her shoulder lightly. "Come, sweetheart," she murmured. "At least a little soup." Naomi hesitated. "I can wait." Margaret gave her a look gentle enough to carry authority. "Truth does not need you hungry." That almost made Naomi smile, but not quite. She took a small step with Margaret toward the pantry door, then stopped again. Mama also said one more thing, she whispered. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, as though bracing for impact had become the rhythm of the night. Tell me. Naomi looked down at the rug before she answered. She said after the lady left. Mama cried because she thought maybe the lady was right. She thought maybe if she loved you, she should disappear. But then she looked at me and said no child should have to pay for somebody else's reputation. Ethan did not speak. He could not. The sentence entered him too deeply to come back out as language. Vanessa looked away first. Not because she was ashamed, though perhaps some dim version of shame had finally found her. She looked away because the room no longer belonged to her version of events. It belonged to the little girl in worn sneakers, and to the dead woman whose absence had begun to speak louder than every living excuse. Naomi finally let Margaret lead her toward the pantry, but before she disappeared through the side door, she turned back once more. Her eyes found Ethan's, and in them he saw fear, exhaustion, and something worse than either one. Practice. The look of a child who had practiced disappointment so long she wore it like weather. My mama said if you looked confused instead of angry, Naomi said softly. That meant you probably did not know. Then she stepped into the pantry light and was gone, leaving Ethan alone in the study with a photograph, a bracelet, a stack of redirected years, and the woman who had stood between him and the truth. When the pantry door closed behind Naomi, the study did not become quieter. It became exposed. The kind of exposed that happens when the one honest person in the room steps away and leaves everyone else alone with what they have done, what they allowed, and what they chose not to see. Ethan Whitmore stood beside the desk with one hand resting on the polished wood, his fingers spread as if the grain itself were the only steady thing left. Outside the tall windows, the winter lawn shimmered under soft ground lights, neat and silent and expensive, the kind of silence money buys so it never has to hear what pain sounds like. Inside, the pain had a shape now. A little black girl with tired eyes. A hospital bracelet. A daisy thrown away. Vanessa remained near the window, but her posture had changed. The practiced elegance was still there, the straight back, the lifted chin, the measured breathing, yet it no longer read as strength. It read as someone holding herself together in the last room where that skill still had value. Daniel stood by the desk with his phone in one hand, waiting for the first call back from records. Margaret was not there now, and her absence changed the room in a way Ethan felt immediately. She had taken something gentle with her. What remained was paper, memory, and consequence. You should sit down, Vanessa said at last, her voice lower now, stripped of the bright polish she wore in public. You are exhausted, and this is exactly the sort of emotional shock people exploit when they want access to powerful men. Ethan let out a breath that almost sounded like laughter, except nothing in it was amused. Powerful men, he said, looking not at her, but at the photograph of Lena on the desk. Is that what you think this is about? Vanessa did not answer quickly enough. Daniel glanced up, then looked away again. Ethan finally turned toward her, and something in his face had settled into place. Not rage. Rage was hot and erratic. This was colder than that. More final. A child walked into my home tonight carrying 9 years of erased truth, he said. Do not insult me by calling that access. Vanessa folded her arms. And do not insult me by pretending your judgment was flawless back then. You were grieving. You were vulnerable. You were reckless with your own life. Somebody had to think strategically. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, the restraint in his voice made every word sharper. You keep using the language of business to explain what you did to a woman in a hospital bed. The sentence hung there, so stripped of decoration it could not be dodged. Vanessa's eyes flickered. I did not harm her. No, Ethan said. You just made sure she suffered alone. That landed. Daniel closed his phone and placed it face down on the desk without comment, but Ethan saw the movement. People always needed something to do with their hands when truth stopped feeling abstract. Vanessa turned away from all of them and looked out at the lawn again. You loved her once, she said, and now there was something else in her voice. Not innocence, not even apology, but old bitterness finally stepping out without makeup on. That was the problem. It was always the problem. She had a way of making you forget scale, forget timing, forget consequence. You became smaller around her. And smaller is dangerous when the whole world is looking at you to stay large. Ethan did not blink. Smaller. Vanessa turned back. Human, she snapped, and the word came out harsher than she meant it to, harsher than she could take back. You became human around her. Distracted. Soft. Willing to throw away rooms you had fought your whole life to enter because one woman with sad eyes made you think love was more important than structure. Ethan looked down for a second, not because her words had convinced him, but because they had revealed more than she intended. Not just what she did, why she did it. Daniel understood it too. Ethan could see it in the attorney's face. This had never been simple jealousy. It had been contempt disguised as protection, ambition dressed up as caretaking. Vanessa had not only feared losing Ethan. She had feared the version of him that love brought out because it made him harder to manage. So that is what Naomi is to you, Ethan said quietly. A disruption in structure. Vanessa lifted her chin. She is evidence that chaos was allowed too close. The study went still all over again. Ethan felt something inside him settle with terrible calm. He had spent most of the night moving from disbelief to grief to dawning recognition. Now recognition finished the job. The woman before him was not merely someone who made a terrible call under pressure. She was someone who had looked at a newborn child and measured her first by inconvenience. The landline on the desk rang, slicing through the room. Daniel reached it first, listened, asked 3 brief questions, and wrote down 2 names on his legal pad. When he hung up, the room seemed to lean toward him. Records found late-night vehicle logs tied to the executive office, he said. One sedan assigned to Mrs. Whitmore's security detail was signed out the morning after the date on the hospital bracelet. Destination field was left blank, which is unusual. There is also an archived reimbursement request from St. Catherine Medical Center for valet access and private visitor entry under a foundation privacy code. Vanessa said nothing. Ethan did not ask if it was true because the silence itself had begun answering for her. Daniel continued, slower now. The archivist is searching visitor relations files and donation records from that quarter. If St. Catherine preserved restricted access logs under donor privileges, we may have a time stamp within the hour. Within the hour. 9 years hidden, and now the truth was moving faster than anyone in the room could control. Ethan walked to the window and stood where Vanessa had been standing before. He looked out at the lawn but saw none of it. He saw Lena in a hospital bed, tired and proud and frightened. He saw some version of himself sitting in another office years ago, signing documents, attending meetings, believing silence meant abandonment instead of interference. He saw Naomi in the gala doorway, small shoulders squared, carrying an envelope like it was both shield and burden. Did you ever think about the child? He asked without turning around. Vanessa's answer came after a beat too long. I told myself children adapt. Ethan closed his eyes. That sentence did something no accusation had managed to do all night. It made the damage feel current. Not historical. Not legal. Personal and ongoing. Naomi had adapted. That was the tragedy. She had adapted to absence, to uncertainty, to hearing stories about a father who might not care, to watching her mother grow weaker while still clinging to one box of paper hope. Ethan turned back around slowly. No, he said. Children survive what adults force them to survive. That is not the same thing. Vanessa opened her mouth as though to push back, but the old confidence was thinning now, fraying at the edges. She had spent years speaking on Ethan's behalf, arranging rooms, filtering access, shaping crises into manageable narratives. But this was no longer a narrative. It was a child eating soup in the next room after crossing a city with her dead mother's evidence because no adult had made the truth easy. The pantry door opened softly then. Margaret stepped back in first, carrying a small tray with a bowl, a teacup, and folded napkins. Naomi followed close behind, moving more slowly now, as though warmth and exhaustion had finally reached her bones at the same time. Ethan saw immediately that she had eaten only a little. The spoon in the bowl was barely touched. She stood in the doorway, watching the adults as if she already knew people could start talking again the moment children left, and change the story to something cleaner. Ethan walked toward her before anyone else could say a word. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. Naomi, he said, and his voice shifted again, gentler now, more careful than anything he had said all evening. The records are coming in. Naomi nodded once, but she was looking at his face, not the papers. Children always knew that faces told the truth before documents did. Did she lie? Naomi asked softly, meaning Vanessa, meaning all the years, meaning everything. Ethan looked at her, then at the tray in Margaret's hands, then back at the little girl who should have been asleep somewhere safe, instead of standing under library lamps in a stranger's study waiting to find out whether her life had been built on a choice or a theft. Yes, he said at last. I think she did. Naomi lowered her eyes for just a second, and when she lifted them again, there was no triumph in them. Only sadness. Then my mama was right, she whispered. And before anyone could answer, Daniel's phone lit up with the hospital archive response. Daniel looked at the screen for 1 second too long before answering, and in a room that had already learned to fear silence, that 1 second mattered. He put the call on speaker without being asked. A tired female voice, calm in the practiced way of hospital administrators who spend their lives handling grief through paperwork, filled the study. This is Angela Morris from St. Catherine Archive Services. I located a restricted visitor access record under Whitmore Foundation privacy credentials dated October 17, 9 years ago, at 11:42 in the morning. No one moved. Naomi stood near Margaret's tray, both hands wrapped around the untouched teacup now as though heat might help her hold steady through whatever came next. Ethan did not take his eyes off Daniel's phone. Angela continued. The visitor entry was signed manually due to system downtime that week. The name on the line is Vanessa Whitmore. Margaret shut her eyes. Daniel lowered his head slightly, not in surprise anymore, but in confirmation. The room had crossed from suspicion into proof. Vanessa did not deny it right away. She only drew a sharp breath through her nose, and that small sound carried more than any argument could have. Ethan stood perfectly still, the kind of stillness that does not mean calm at all. Only that anger has been forced so far inward it has become something heavier. Is there anything else? Daniel asked. Papers rustled faintly on the other end. Yes, Angela said. There is a note attached by a charge nurse because the visitor requested privacy beyond standard policy. It states, visitor insisted conversation concerned legal and family matters and upset patient significantly. Nurse returned to room after 6 minutes and documented patient distress. Naomi lowered her eyes. Margaret's fingers tightened around the tray cloth. Ethan finally spoke, and his voice was so even it made the words worse. Thank you, Ms. Morris. Preserve everything. Digital copy, scan of the signature, internal notes, billing trail, valet log, all of it. My office will send the formal request in the next 10 minutes. Understood, Mr. Whitmore. The line clicked dead. No one rushed to fill the silence that followed. It settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Naomi held the teacup with both hands, but did not drink. She looked not at Vanessa, not at Daniel, not even at the desk where all the evidence lay, but at Ethan, as if this was the moment that mattered most. Not whether he had been fooled, whether he would finally stay with the truth now that it was painful enough to cost him something. Vanessa gave a short, brittle laugh that fell apart before it fully formed. Upset patient significantly, she repeated. That is what this all becomes. A nursing note and some old signatures. Ethan turned toward her slowly. No, he said. It becomes the moment you walked into a hospital room where a woman had just given birth to my child and decided you had the right to speak for me. Vanessa's face hardened, but it no longer carried the effortless authority she wore so naturally in public. Now it looked strained, lit from underneath by something close to panic. I did speak for you, she said. Because you were not in any shape to speak for yourself. You were drowning, Ethan. You do not get to rewrite that part. And you do not get to rewrite her life. The words landed with such force that even Daniel stepped back from the desk. Naomi flinched at the volume, not because Ethan shouted, but because the truth had finally started sounding like pain instead of procedure. Ethan saw her reaction immediately, and his whole body changed. The anger did not vanish, but it bent around the child in the room. That was new. That was the version of him Vanessa had always feared. He stepped back, lowered his voice, and looked at Naomi first before he looked anywhere else. I am sorry, he said quietly. Naomi said nothing, but her fingers loosened slightly around the cup. Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. You are apologizing now? To a child you met an hour ago. Ethan's gaze shifted to her, and whatever gentleness had entered his voice for Naomi disappeared. I am apologizing to my daughter because she should not have had to bring me proof that I failed to look for hard enough. Naomi's lips parted again on that word. Daughter. This time Ethan did not seem to realize he had said it. Or perhaps he did, and no longer cared who heard it. Vanessa looked from him to Naomi with something ugly in her expression, something that had lived under all the satin and polished language from the beginning. You do not even know that she is yours. Daniel spoke before Ethan could. Given the age, the timeline, the medical record, the preserved correspondence, and the hospital access log, I would advise you not to keep leaning on uncertainty as though it is still your strongest ground. Vanessa turned on him. Whose attorney are you? Daniel took off his glasses and folded them in one hand. Tonight? The truths. It was the kind of line that would have sounded theatrical anywhere else. In that room, it sounded tired. Naomi looked at Daniel with quiet surprise, then back at Ethan. The child was exhausted now. It showed in the way she leaned slightly toward the desk without meaning to, in the faint shadows under her eyes, in the careful effort it took to stay composed while adults kept putting her existence on trial. Margaret moved closer and rested the tray on the side table. Sweetheart, sit for a minute, she murmured. Naomi obeyed this time, climbing back into the chair with the teacup still in both hands. Ethan watched her settle, watched how small she looked against all that dark leather and carved wood, and something inside him seemed to break in a quieter place than rage could reach. He remembered school fundraisers he had donated to without attending. Holiday cards he had signed by autopen while believing there was no one left to send personal notes to. Hospital wings named after his father. Foundations. Endowments. Entire buildings of public generosity built by a man who had not known his own child needed bus fare to come tell him the truth. What exactly did you say to Lena in that room? He asked Vanessa. She looked away. That was answer enough, but Ethan did not let it end there. Say it. I told her. Vanessa said slowly, each word dragged out by the inevitability of being cornered, that if she cared about you at all, she would stop reaching for a life that had moved on. Naomi stared down into her tea as though the surface might blur the sentence before it could reach her fully. Ethan's expression did not change, but Daniel saw his hand close into a fist at his side, and then open again just as quickly. Controlled. Barely. Vanessa kept going, perhaps because now that the lie had cracked, some part of her wanted to turn the shards into justification. I told her you were rebuilding. I told her the board would destroy you if scandal touched your name again. I told her a child born into confusion would only suffer more. Naomi lifted her head at that. I still suffered, she said softly. That was the sentence that ended Vanessa's power in the room. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was plain. Plain enough that no strategy could survive it. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief second, then opened them and looked at Naomi as though he were seeing not only the little girl in front of him, but the whole missing life behind her. No more tonight, he said, though whether he was speaking to Vanessa, to Daniel, to the room, or to himself, even he might not have known. He walked to the chair across from Naomi and lowered himself into it, not like a billionaire, not like a man in command, but like someone finally willing to sit at eye level with what his absence had cost. Naomi looked at him over the rim of her cup, cautious, tired, and heartbreakingly polite. Ethan swallowed once before he asked the question that mattered more now than signatures, visitor logs, or even blame. Naomi, he said, his voice quieter than it had been. All night. Where did you sleep after your mother died? Naomi did not answer right away. She looked down into the tea as if the faint curl of steam above it might offer her a safer place to put her eyes than the face of the man asking the question. The study had gone so quiet that Ethan could hear the soft tap of the grandfather clock again, and, somewhere downstairs, the distant hush of staff clearing the last traces of a gala that no longer seemed to belong to this house. Naomi's sneakers hung just above the rug. One lace was frayed near the end. Ethan saw that too, and hated that he noticed such things only now, when noticing could not undo anything. At Ms. Louise's apartment the first night, Naomi said at last, her voice small but steady. She was not my real grandma, but everybody on the block called her Nana Lou because she always kept peppermints in her purse and knew when people were sad even before they did. Ethan felt the words land somewhere deep and tender and unbearable. Nana Lou, not a lawyer, not a trustee, not a foundation-appointed guardian, just a woman with peppermints and intuition who had become the nearest thing Naomi had to family after Lena was gone. Naomi kept speaking, slowly now, as if pulling each sentence through tiredness. Then the landlord came by and said we could stay a little longer, but he kept asking if there was somebody from my family he should call. Mama had a notebook with numbers in it, but most of them were old. A church lady helped with the funeral papers. She knew my mama from the food pantry. Margaret brought a hand to her mouth and looked away. Daniel lowered himself into the chair near the desk, not because he was tired, but because the room had stopped feeling like a place where standing made sense. Vanessa said nothing. For once, silence was the only honest thing she had left. Ethan leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly enough that the knuckles paled. "And after that?" he asked. Naomi glanced up at him, and there was no accusation in her face, which somehow hurt more than if there had been. "I slept on the couch 2 nights. Then the church lady said social services would start asking questions if nobody from family came. Nana Lou told me before she died that if that happened, I had to take the envelope and come here first." Ethan swallowed. The room around him, all dark wood and old books and inherited power, suddenly felt obscene in its size. A child had counted nights on a couch, while this house glowed with catered candles and imported flowers. A child had traveled here with an envelope because the systems around her life had names for her, but no one for her. "How did you get here?" Ethan asked. Naomi looked down at her cup again. "Bus first, then another bus. Then I walked from the corner because I did not want anybody to think I was asking for a ride for the wrong reason." The sentence was pure child logic and brutal truth all at once. Ethan shut his eyes for a brief second. She had thought about being misunderstood before she thought about being tired. That did not come from one bad day. That came from practice. Margaret moved closer and laid a folded napkin near Naomi's cup, though there was nothing to wipe. It was simply something kind to do with her hands. "Did anyone come with you, sweetheart?" Naomi shook her head. "No, ma'am. Mrs. Evelyn from church wanted to, but she works nights at the nursing home and said if she missed another shift she might lose the job. I told her I could do it. Mama said if I ever found him, I had to do it with my shoulders back and tell the truth straight." Ethan heard the word him and felt it like a bruise. Not Dad. Not yet. Him. A man in a story. A name in a box. Someone real enough to search for and distant enough to travel toward alone. Daniel finally spoke, and his voice was gentler than Ethan had ever heard it. "Do you have any legal guardian listed on record? Any aunt, uncle, godparent?" Naomi shook her head again. "Mama's sister died before I was born, and Nana Lou said my mama stopped talking to most people after she got sick because she did not want pity from folks who disappeared when bills showed up." Ethan could see Lena doing exactly that. Pride had always lived close to tenderness in her, not because she was cold, but because she hated being looked at like a tragedy before her story was done. He remembered that now with painful clarity. The way she once paid for her own coffee, even when he had cash in hand, just to prove love, did not mean debt. The way she laughed at his expensive coat and called it a banker's blanket. Vanessa shifted near the window, perhaps irritated by memory entering the room without her permission. "This is sad," she said quietly. "But sadness does not determine paternity or rewrite practical realities." Ethan turned his head toward her, and the look he gave her was so tired it seemed older than anger. "Do you hear yourself?" he asked. Vanessa lifted her chin. "I hear a child with no formal guardian, no verified claim, and a dead mother who left behind emotional material, but no legal certainty. That is what I hear." Naomi's fingers tightened around the cup again. Ethan noticed at once. He stood so suddenly that the chair legs brushed the rug with a low scrape. "Not loud, just final." "Then let me make the practical reality clear for you," he said. "Until every record is verified, every test is complete, and every missing year is accounted for, Naomi Carter is under my protection." Vanessa gave a thin, incredulous smile. "You cannot simply declare, 'I can,'" Ethan said, and the interruption carried a force that stopped her cold. "I can because she is 9 years old, alone, and here because the adults in this story failed her first. Whatever comes next, she does not leave this house tonight wondering where she belongs." Naomi looked up at him so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Hope did not brighten her face. It made it fragile. Children who have wanted something too long do not light up immediately when it appears. They brace for it to disappear. Margaret's eyes shone, but she kept her composure. Daniel stood, already reaching for his phone. I can call Family Services Council and have emergency temporary care paperwork drafted before midnight, he said. Given the circumstances, if Mr. Whitmore signs a protective lodging and supervision affidavit pending confirmation and review, there should be no issue keeping Naomi here tonight and moving to a formal petition in the morning. Ethan nodded once. Do it. Vanessa looked from one to the other as if language itself had started betraying her. This is insane. You are changing the legal posture of your household because of a story told under emotional pressure. No, Ethan said. I am changing the moral posture of my life because the story turned out to be true. Daniel stepped into the hall to make the call. The study door clicked softly behind him. Margaret drew another chair closer to Naomi and laid a cashmere throw across its back, not presumptuous enough to place it over the child herself, just close enough that Naomi could take it if she wanted. Naomi looked at the blanket, then at Ethan. I do not need fancy stuff, she said quietly. Ethan's expression softened in a way that made him look less like the man from magazine covers and more like someone stripped down to his truest shape for the first time in years. I know, he said. That is probably one of the reasons this house should have met you sooner. Naomi stared at him for a long moment. My mama used to say rich people apologize with checks, she said. Is that what this is? Margaret went still. Vanessa almost smiled, as if the question might embarrass him. But Ethan did not flinch. No, he said. This is me trying not to let another night pass with you carrying this alone. The answer changed something small in Naomi's face. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of curiosity. She set the teacup carefully onto the tray and asked, in the same calm voice she had used since walking into the ballroom, if you really did not know about me, why did you stop looking for my mama? Ethan felt the question enter him like cold air into an open wound. He did not answer immediately because anything quick would have been a lie. He looked at the photograph on the desk, at Lena's smile caught forever in a summer wind, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone low with shame. Because after a while, he said, I let silence convince me of something I should have had the courage to doubt. Naomi absorbed that without blinking. Children knew when adults were finally telling the truth because truth never rushed to defend itself. Outside in the hall, Daniel's voice could be heard faintly giving instructions, efficient and urgent. Inside the study, the old clock ticked on. Ethan looked at Naomi, really looked at her, and saw the weight of travel still in her shoulders, the careful manners of a child who had learned not to ask for too much, the exhausted dignity of someone far too young to arrive this composed in crisis. You are staying here tonight, he said gently, in a real bedroom, with the door open if you want, closed if you do not. Margaret can help you choose what feels safe. Nobody will move you, question you, or take your things without asking. Not anymore. Naomi's gaze dropped to the envelope still resting on the desk. My things are just papers, she murmured. Ethan followed her gaze. No, he said. Tonight they were proof. Tomorrow they become the beginning. And in the silence that followed, Naomi did not smile, but she did something even smaller and more important. She nodded. Daniel returned to the study with 2 phones in his hands and urgency still clinging to his coat, sleeves like cold air from the hall. He was not a man easily rattled, but tonight his precision had picked up speed. Temporary protective lodging papers are being drafted now, he said. Family Services Council will email them within 15 minutes. I also reached a judge's clerk who owes me 3 favors and a golf apology. If needed, we can have emergency review at 8 in the morning. Ethan nodded once. The business part of his mind heard the details, sorted them, accepted them. But the rest of him was still in the chair across from Naomi, still staring at the frayed lace on one sneaker and the careful way she kept her envelope close even now, as if paper had become the only object in the world with permission to fail her less than people did. Naomi sat quietly beneath the warm study lamps, the cashmere throw now folded across her lap, because Margaret had placed it there only after asking, and that asking had mattered. Ethan noticed she kept smoothing the corner of it with 2 fingers as though testing whether something soft could be trusted if it belonged to a house this large. Vanessa remained near the window, but the room had stopped arranging itself around her. That power was gone now. What she had left was posture, and posture was a poor substitute for innocence. There is another issue, Daniel said, glancing from Ethan to Naomi and back again. The trust documents. Ethan's eyes sharpened. What about them? Daniel set one phone down and opened a folder on the other. 3 years ago, Vanessa pushed for revised succession contingencies tied to marital estate continuity, private inheritance pathways, and public reputation risk. At the time, it read like standard insulation. Tonight it reads differently. Vanessa's head turned. That is a grotesque interpretation. Daniel did not flinch. It is an educated one. Ethan held out his hand. Daniel passed him the screen. The legal language was dense, but not dense enough to hide the shape of intent once he knew where to look. If unacknowledged biological claims emerged after a defined period of non-contact, the estate could argue abandonment of relationship as a factor in limiting informal standing pending private review. Private review. Ethan stared at the phrase until it blurred. You planned for this, he said, not loudly, not with disbelief anymore, but with the exhausted clarity of a man finally understanding how many layers had been built around his blindness. Vanessa crossed her arms. I planned for opportunists. Wealth attracts stories. Wealth attracts claimants. Naomi looked up from the blanket, and Ethan felt the moment she understood that Vanessa was speaking about children like her, children with the wrong skin, the wrong zip code, the wrong timing, the wrong mother, children whose existence became suspect the moment money entered the sentence. I am not a claimant, Naomi said quietly. I am a kid. The study went still again. That was happening more often now, Ethan noticed. Truth from Naomi never arrived dressed for battle. It arrived small and direct and impossible to defend against. Daniel lowered his eyes for a second. Margaret stood near the bookshelf with one hand pressed lightly over the other, as though stillness itself had become a form of prayer. Ethan set the phone down on the desk. Did you ever think about what would happen if the child came looking? He asked Vanessa. She lifted her chin. I thought if there was a child, she would be raised quietly somewhere far from this circus. Naomi frowned. Quietly means poor, right? Vanessa's mouth tightened. She did not answer. Ethan did. Too often, yes. Naomi absorbed that without surprise, and that broke something open in him all over again. She was 9 years old and already understood the translation of polite cruelty. Ethan looked at her hands. Small hands. Steady hands. Hands that had held bus rails, an envelope, a teacup, the whole weight of delayed truth. He thought of every conference room where people praised his strategic vision, every magazine profile that called him disciplined, every award engraved with words like legacy and stewardship. And meanwhile, the truest measure of stewardship had traveled across the city alone because no one with power had made room for her to exist safely. Naomi, he said gently. She looked at him. When your mother got sick, who took care of you? Naomi's answer came after a pause, but not because she was inventing anything. Because memory, for children, always arrived carrying pictures first. Sometimes Mama still did, even when she should not have. Sometimes Nana Lou. Sometimes I stayed in the church office after school because Miss Evelyn had choir practice and said I could color in the back if I stayed quiet. Once I sat at the laundromat for 2 hours because Mama was at the clinic longer than she thought. Ethan swallowed hard. Alone? Naomi nodded. The lady there gave me crackers. Daniel looked away. Margaret shut her eyes briefly. Vanessa stared toward the dark window, perhaps because looking at the child now required more humanity than she had prepared to show. Ethan felt shame move through him in waves, but beneath it something steadier was forming. Not performance, not guilt alone. Decision, the kind that did not ask permission from appearances. Daniel's email alert chimed. He opened the message, skimmed, and nodded. The protective lodging affidavit is here. Emergency custodial petition draft will follow. Ethan took the tablet and signed where Daniel indicated without reading slowly, not because he was careless, but because for once delay felt immoral. Daniel sent the documents back out at once. The sound of the email leaving was so ordinary it almost mocked the scale of the night. Years of damage. One soft electronic whoosh. Ethan set the tablet aside and looked directly at Naomi. There will be paperwork in the morning, he said. Too much of it. People with titles. Questions. Offices. But tonight, before any of that, I need you to hear me clearly. Naomi sat straighter, not out of fear, but because children know when adults are stepping toward a sentence that might matter later. Ethan kept his voice low. You are not here because I am doing you a favor. You are here because I should have found the truth sooner. Naomi searched his face with that same careful seriousness she had brought into the ballroom. Are you trying to make up for it? she asked. Ethan could have said yes. It would have been honest, but incomplete. I am trying to stop the damage from continuing, he said. Making up for it will take longer than one night. Naomi looked down at the blanket in her lap, thinking in the way children do when they are trying to decide whether honesty in adults is a coincidence or a pattern. Mama used to say sorry is easy when you have money, she murmured. She said staying is harder. Ethan felt the sentence settle into him more deeply than any accusation Vanessa had thrown. Staying, not paying, not fixing in one grand gesture. Staying through paperwork, fear, awkward breakfasts, school forms, questions with no immediate good answer, and grief that would not move on command. Your mother was right, he said quietly. Naomi lifted her eyes again. This time there was something different in them. Not trust, still not that, but less distance. As if a small locked room inside her had heard a knock instead of a command. Daniel cleared his throat softly and gathered the legal printouts. A guest room can be prepared on the east side where staff can remain close without crowding her, he said. Margaret nodded. I know the blue room. Softer light. Garden view. The windows do not rattle in the wind. Naomi glanced between them, and Ethan saw the hesitation before it became words. Can my envelope stay with me? She asked. Ethan answered at once. Yes. Margaret added. And your teacup too, if that helps. The faintest shadow of a smile touched Naomi's mouth and disappeared so quickly Ethan almost thought he imagined it. But he had not. It was there, small as the first sign of dawn. Vanessa gave a brittle exhale from across the room. So that is it. A child appears with old grief and suddenly your entire life changes direction in one evening. Ethan stood and looked at her fully. No, he said. My life changed direction 9 years ago. I just found out tonight. The words stayed in the room long after he finished them. Naomi looked at him, then with a kind of quiet understanding too old for her age, as though she knew some truths arrive late, but still count if the person hearing them finally stops running. Margaret moved gently toward her. Come on, sweetheart, she said. Let us get you somewhere warm and still. Naomi slid carefully from the chair, clutching the envelope to her chest. She took 2 steps, then stopped and turned back to Ethan. The study lights caught in her eyes, and for one suspended second, he saw Lena there so clearly it nearly took the breath from him. If I go to sleep here, Naomi asked softly, will you still be here in the morning? Ethan did not answer fast, because some promises deserve the weight of a full breath before they were made. Then he said, yes, I will. And Naomi, after everything, chose to believe him enough to nod. The house changed after midnight. Not in sound, because Whitmore House had always known how to be quiet, but in temperature, in weight, in the way silence stopped feeling expensive and started feeling honest. The gala had ended hours earlier. The last black sedan had rolled past the gates. Downstairs, the crystal had been cleared, the candles extinguished, the flowers left to lean in their tall arrangements like guests too tired to stand. Upstairs, in the blue room on the east side, Naomi Carter finally slept. Margaret had left the lamp on low because Naomi said complete darkness made rooms feel borrowed. The envelope rested on the nightstand beside her, tucked under one small hand the way other children might hold a stuffed rabbit or a worn blanket. Ethan had stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, trying to reconcile the size of her in that bed with the scale of what had already been stolen from her. 9 years, 9 birthdays, school mornings, fevers, lost teeth, science fairs, questions asked into the dark. A whole childhood built around an absence that had not been an accident at all. He closed the door softly and returned to the study, where the lamps still burned and the paperwork had grown into stacks. Daniel was at the desk with fresh printouts from the overnight archivist, and Vanessa was no longer by the window. She sat now in the leather chair she had once occupied with ease, but there was nothing easy in her posture anymore. She looked like a woman who had been outrun by paper. Margaret stood near the bookshelf, hands folded, eyes tired, refusing sleep until the child upstairs was safe enough to let the night end. Ethan did not sit. What else? He asked. Daniel slid a file across the desk. Hospital billing preserved an auxiliary form attached to the restricted visitor access. It includes a handwritten notation from the attending administrator because the visitor referenced legal standing and future reputational harm. The signature matches Vanessa's archived foundation signature card. Ethan read the lines slowly. Visitor claimed continuing contact with subject's partner would destabilize donor household and create public complications if paternity was alleged. The words were cold enough to leave frost. Partner, donor household, public complications. A woman in a hospital bed had been translated into a liability memo. Ethan looked at Vanessa. You said that to them. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time all night, there was no polished answer ready at her mouth. Only fatigue, anger, and the brittle remains of conviction. I said what I thought would stop a disaster before it spread. Ethan almost spoke, then stopped, because the room had taught him something tonight. Quick words tended to serve the wrong person. Daniel turned another page. There is more. The archive team found a scanned correspondence draft in the old executive mail system. It was never sent through the official channel, which means someone generated it locally and removed it before routine retention. It was recovered from a backup partition. He passed the page over. Ethan knew what it was before he fully saw it. The wording was familiar because Naomi had carried its ghost in her envelope. Delivery failed. No response requested. Do not contact Mr. Whitmore again. Only now there was metadata at the bottom. Drafted from Terminal W Executive Suite B. Edited by V. Whitmore. Timestamp. 9 years ago, 5:47 p.m. Ethan felt the room tilt without moving. Not because he still doubted. Doubt had died an hour ago. Because proof, when it finally arrives, does not soften anything. It hardens grief into shape. Margaret lowered her head. Daniel exhaled slowly. Vanessa closed her eyes for one brief second, as if even she had not expected the machine to remember what she had spent years trying to bury. Why? Ethan asked. It was not the first time he had asked the question that night, but now it had changed. Earlier it meant explain yourself. Now it meant tell the truth, while any part of it is still yours to give. Vanessa opened her eyes again and looked at him with something like defiance, though the flame of it had burned lower. Because you were finally becoming who you needed to be, she said. Because every time she came near your life, you became sentimental, irrational, impossible to steer. Because men like you do not survive on feeling. They survive on distance. Ethan stared at her. And what do children survive on? Vanessa said nothing. Daniel looked down. Margaret, who had kept her counsel for years, finally spoke with quiet steadiness. Not distance. The single sentence seemed to shame the whole room more effectively than outrage could have done. Ethan set the recovered draft on the desk beside the photograph of Lena and the hospital bracelet. 3 objects now. Memory. Proof. Loss. The line between them had vanished. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Another message from Daniel's contacts. He opened it, scanned, and went still. The Emergency Family Services review is complete, he said. Given the evidence, Naomi can remain here under temporary custodial protection while formal paternity testing is expedited. Morning appointment confirmed for 7:30. Private lab. In-house chain of custody. Daniel nodded. That is fast. Ethan looked toward the study door, toward the hallway beyond it, toward the sleeping child upstairs who had crossed the city because adults with money and titles had made truth unreachable. It is late, he said, but not too late for that. Vanessa gave a hollow laugh. So this is where I disappear, then? Quietly, so the household can correct its narrative. Ethan turned to her, and whatever he might have said as her husband no longer existed in him. What remained was something simpler and more exact. This house is not correcting a narrative, he said. It is making room for the life you tried to erase. Vanessa's face tightened. You are condemning me with one version of events. Ethan picked up the recovered draft and held it between 2 fingers. No, you condemned yourself with handwriting, visitor logs, routing forms, reimbursement codes, and 9 years of silence that benefited only you. She stood. Then, but even standing could not restore what she had lost. The study no longer bent around her presence. It held her the way a courtroom holds a witness who has run out of answers. I loved you, she said, and maybe she believed that was the final defense. Ethan's expression did not soften. Then you should have known love does not decide for people. It does not steal years from a child and call it structure. The words landed and stayed. Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, perhaps searching for the man who would still protect appearances, still postpone consequence, still call the damage complicated instead of cruel. He was gone. Daniel gathered the files into ordered stacks. Margaret moved toward the side table, and straightened Naomi's untouched napkin from earlier, a tiny act of care in a room full of broken grander things. Ethan checked the time. A little after 1 in the morning. In 6 hours he would walk Naomi into a lab she should never have needed. In 7, lawyers would start using words like petition and standing in immediate best interest. In 8, the sun would rise on a house that could no longer pretend it had been innocent yesterday. He took a slow breath and looked at Daniel. Prepare whatever removal documents are necessary for Vanessa's access to my private office, correspondence permissions, foundation accounts, and household authority. Effective now. Vanessa stared at him. You would do that tonight? Ethan thought of Naomi asking if he would still be here in the morning. He thought of Lena in a hospital bed being told to disappear quietly. He thought of a child holding an envelope like it was the only safe thing in the world. Yes, he said. Tonight is already 9 years late. Daniel nodded and began making notes. Margaret finally touched Ethan's sleeve lightly, just enough to draw his attention without interrupting the gravity of the room. She asked for one thing before she fell asleep, Margaret said softly. Ethan's face changed at once. What? She asked if there was any picture of her mother in this house that was not hidden in a drawer. The question entered him more gently than everything else that night, and for that very reason it hurt the most. Ethan looked down at the photograph on the desk, the old Charleston harbor caught forever in summer light, Lena smiling into wind, his younger self beside her, unaware of everything waiting just beyond the frame. He picked it up with both hands. There will be by morning, he said. Then he looked once more toward the hallway, toward the blue room, and knew with a certainty deeper than law, deeper than blood tests, deeper even than shame, that the child upstairs had not come to ask for money or rescue or revenge. She had come for recognition, and by dawn, one way or another, she was going to have it. Dawn entered Whitmore House quietly, not through the grand front windows where morning usually arrived polished and impressive, but through the east side glass where the garden light came soft and gray across the floorboards like mercy that did not need to announce itself. The blue room door stood half open. Ethan had not slept. He had changed out of the tuxedo hours ago, but his white shirt was still wrinkled at the cuffs, and there was a heaviness in his face no tailor, no title, no amount of money could smooth away. In his hands he carried 2 things. The old photograph from Charleston, now set in a simple silver frame Margaret found in the downstairs sitting room, and a small plate with toast cut into neat squares because Margaret said children sometimes trusted breakfast more when it looked uncomplicated. Naomi was awake, though only barely. She sat cross-legged near the center of the bed in an oversized cotton sleep shirt Margaret had found in the linen closet, her envelope beside her, one hand still resting on it, as if sleep had not fully convinced her that morning would keep its promises. She looked toward the door when Ethan appeared, and for a second he saw the instinctive caution return, the small, practiced pause of a child checking whether the kindness of the night had survived daylight. He stepped in slowly. I told you I would still be here, he said. Naomi blinked once, then nodded, because she remembered. Ethan crossed the room and set the plate on the bedside table first, then the framed photograph beside it. Naomi's gaze moved to the picture and stayed there. Lena, younger and laughing into harbor wind. Ethan beside her, serious even in happiness. Naomi reached out, but only with one finger at first, touching the edge of the frame instead of the glass. That is really her, she whispered. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Yes, he said, and it should not have taken this long for her to be seen in this house. Naomi looked up at him, and in the soft morning light her face looked even younger than it had beneath the study lamps the night before. 9. Just 9. Old enough to travel alone with grief and evidence. Still young enough to need someone to tell her breakfast was safe to eat. Did you sleep? She asked. Ethan almost smiled at that, not because the question was light, but because it was so human, so immediate, so unlike the legal language and hidden records that had filled the night. Not really, he admitted. Naomi glanced at the toast. Me neither. He pulled the chair from the writing desk and turned it so he could sit near the bed without towering over her. Margaret said tea helped a little. Naomi nodded. And the lamp. Her fingers moved once over the envelope. I kept waking up to make sure this was still here. Ethan looked at the worn paper and felt the old shame rise again, but now it no longer paralyzed him. It instructed him. You will not have to guard everything alone anymore. he said quietly. Naomi studied his face the way she always did before deciding whether to trust a sentence. Then she looked back at the photograph. Mama would have liked this picture being out, she said. She used to say hiding pictures makes people act like memories are guilty. Ethan closed his eyes for one brief second. That sounded exactly like Lena. Plain spoken and exact, with a way of turning ordinary objects into moral truths. He opened his eyes again and asked, "What else did she say?" Naomi thought for a moment, then picked up a square of toast with careful fingers. She said if you ever told the truth, it would probably sound tired before it sounded pretty. Ethan let out the faintest breath of a laugh, though grief sat underneath it. Your mother was right about a lot of things. Naomi took a small bite, then another. The room settled around that simple act in a way Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Not the gala, not the signatures, not the legal calls. This, a child, eating breakfast in safety after too many nights without certainty. He reached into his shirt pocket and removed a folded sheet Daniel had sent up before sunrise. There is one more thing, he said. Naomi's shoulders tightened slightly. He noticed at once. Nothing bad, he added. The lab confirmed they can see us at 7:30. Fast, quiet, private. Daniel says the results can be rushed. I wanted to tell you before anyone else started using complicated words around you. Naomi swallowed her bite and nodded slowly. The test is to prove if you are my dad. Ethan did not hide from it. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Do you need the paper for that? The question was not angry. That made it harder. Ethan answered with the truth because nothing else had any right to live between them now. No, he said softly. I need the paper for the courts and the records and every place that respects a document faster than it respects a child. I do not need the paper to care what happens to you. Naomi lowered her eyes to the toast in her hand. The room went quiet, but it was no longer the sharp silence of accusation. It was the quiet of something fragile trying to exist without being rushed. I do not know when to call you Dad, she said at last, almost to the blanket instead of to him. Ethan felt the sentence enter him gently and leave damage anyway. You do not have to decide that today, he said. Or because of a test. Or because of this house. You get to decide it when it feels true in your own mouth. Naomi looked up then, and something in her expression eased. Not fully, not all the way, but enough. Outside, the first full sun touched the garden hedges. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked softly as Margaret moved about the morning. The world had not stopped for their grief. It had simply arrived and waited to see what they would do with it. Ethan stood and offered Naomi his hand, then paused before coming too close. Would you like me to carry the picture, or do you want to? Naomi wiped her fingertips carefully on the napkin before reaching for the frame herself. I will, she said. Mama would want me to. Ethan nodded. Then, I will carry the envelope. Naomi handed it to him after the briefest hesitation, and the trust in that one small motion nearly undid him more than the paternity test ever could. He took it carefully, like something holy and overdue. Together they walked out of the blue room and into the hall, the morning pale around them, the house still and listening. At the top of the staircase, Naomi stopped and looked down toward the long entrance where she had stood alone the night before, a little black girl in worn sneakers against marble and crystal and disbelief. Now she was not alone. Ethan followed her gaze and understood the distance between those two moments could never be measured in feet. It was measured in recognition, in accountability, in the first honest step after years of silence. Naomi turned to him then, her small hand still wrapped around the framed photo of Lena, and asked the question that mattered more than any blood result, any trust document, any court order Daniel could prepare. After the test, she said softly, are you still going to want to know everything about her? Ethan looked at the picture in her hands, at the child holding it, at the morning finally touching the house without asking permission, and answered from the deepest true place left in him. Yes, he said, because I did not only lose years with you. I lost years with the woman who carried you. I intend to learn both of you now, if you will let me. Naomi stood very still, and then, with the quiet seriousness that had marked every brave thing she had done since stepping into his life, she gave one small nod. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. They started down the stairs together, and in the soft light of that new morning, with Lena's photograph between them and the envelope no longer carried by a child alone, Whitmore House did not feel like a mansion anymore. It felt, for the first time in years, like a place trying to become worthy of the people inside it.